looking back at 2024 and the stories that made headlines here in Hawaii.
Plus, what's next for 2025 in the world of politics and the economy? We've got the experts live in studio. Spotlight Now starts now.
You're watching Spotlight Now with Ryan Kalei-Suchi and Yunji Denise on Hawaii News Now. Have questions or comments for our guests? Join the conversation in our Facebook live stream. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Aloha and thanks for tuning in, and happy New Year's Eve to all of you watching. We hope that you are having an enjoyable day and getting ready for the celebrations later tonight. As we mentioned here today, we're going to be focusing in on the headlines and the stories that we've covered over the last year here in Hawaii.
Yeah, so many things happened in 2024 when it comes to politics, the economy, and just news in general. We want to start out with the economy, and to do that, we've brought in the best of the best. Carl Bonham is with us live in the studio today. He, of course, is the executive director at UHERO and also professor of economics. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So let's start by looking back. 2024, how did Hawaii do, and how did we do as a country overall?
Yeah, 2024 was an interesting year, and I would say the biggest news about the overall U.S. economy, and really the biggest story about economics, has really been how strong the U.S. economy has been, how resilient it's been. I mean, it's been almost 3 years of national unemployment rate of around 4%, adding hundreds of thousands of jobs every month, growing U.S. GDP at near 3% a year for the last several years. Nobody expected this kind of resilience, strong consumer spending, and all that, while at the same time we're bringing inflation from 9% to about 2.5% without any increase in unemployment. Right, the number of jobs that were created. So that's really the big story, and that's been incredibly important for Hawaii. Right, I mean, as of now, U.S. visitors to the state make up between 75 and 80% of all visitor spending in the state. And so if the U.S., basically where the U.S. economy goes, so too does our tourism industry in the current situation. Overall, Hawaii's economy did about as well as you could have hoped for in 2024, given the impacts of the wildfire and how that impacted tourism.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about that more locally. Was that surprising to you folks? I mean, when you think back to the same time last year, as you're heading into 2024, looking at the impacts of the wildfire, what happened at Lahaina, and now having this whole year in retrospect to look back at some of the things that maybe you thought were going to pan out this year, what were some of those biggest surprises of what maybe transpired?
So, the really things have gone somewhat to script. I would say the one thing that has maybe been a little disappointing and a little bit surprising is how sort of stagnant the tourism recovery has been on Maui. And you had sort of an initial return of some visitors outside of the west side, and to the west side as well in October of last year, and then it just kind of went sideways, and stayed that way. And we're just now starting to see a little bit of an uptick there. And so that was a particular surprise. I would say that the recovery of jobs and certainly the decline in the unemployment rate on Maui has been a little bit of a surprise. But the decline in the unemployment rate is not necessarily a good thing, because a great deal of that came about because people left the labor force. So and then the sort of continued surprise has been just how strong the construction sector has been. We've been talking about it for multiple years now. Before the wildfire, we were talking about how construction was going to be leading with all the spending out of Pearl Harbor and the federal money for climate adaptation and things like that. But still continue to be surprised. If you look at the construction job counts right now, they're at all-time records. The last time we were anywhere close to this level of construction jobs was back in 2007. And if you look at all of last year, almost half of all the jobs created in the state were in construction.
Wow, that's
Which
so
was-
interesting.
Yeah, it was really, I mean, I was kind of fascinated when I saw it. And so, yeah, I mean, really the overall picture, I don't think we've changed our forecasts all that much from quarter to quarter. Total economic output in the state was basically flat last year. If you look at GDP, and then we deflate GDP using the Honolulu Consumer Price Index rather than national price indices. And when you do that, you get no growth for the first half of 2024. It's the latest data we have. And I guess the one other surprise is inflation resumed in 2024, right? So for all of 2024, I don't think anybody was forecasting that inflation was going to pick up like it did. And we're going to see 4.5% inflation for 2024 after being down at 3% in 23. So that was a surprise.
And not a good one, I would think.
No, not a good one.
I
Yeah.
want to key into something that you said, and that was that balance of tourists and how many are coming from the continent as opposed to overseas. We know, of course, that all of Hawaii right now loves to go to Japan, not really happening the other way. What do you think that goes, that sort of indicates going forward when it comes to the tourism mix and getting those foreigners back to coming to visit here?
So if you look at the non-Japanese international market, it has recovered in terms of bodies to about 90% of pre-pandemic levels. So pretty robust recovery. U.S. visitors had recovered to 100. Well, they bounced back during the pandemic and then have sort of slid back to around 100% of pre-pandemic level. The straggler is Japan, right? So Japanese visitors are at about 45% of pre-pandemic level right now, and just has very much stalled out. Now, we haven't seen the numbers yet from the marathon. I'm sure that will help a little bit, but we don't anticipate that full Japanese recovery anytime in the next 4 or 5 years. And that's a combination of cost factors, right? I mean, the cost of a trip to Hawaii has changed dramatically for Japanese visitors. And they're different visitors. As time goes on, people get older and they stop traveling, and we're not going back to the 90s at those levels, and we don't even think we're going to reach back to pre-pandemic level of Japanese visitors anytime soon.
Wow, 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, when you look at just the tourism industry, and we know that continues to be something that's important for the economy of Hawaii, but was there any other sector this past year that you maybe noticed seeing an uptick, or something that could potentially be another industry for Hawaii to maybe pay attention on and maybe invest in moving forward?
Well, so the big one was construction, as I've already mentioned. But in terms of identifying emerging industries, is something that we're working on, and there's lots of areas where you would expect Hawaii to have sort of stronger activity, everything from aquaculture and diversified ag to areas of tourism, from health tourism, all of those, and there's an excellent report that Stephen Bond Smith wrote that's on our website that goes into great detail on sort of trying to identify industries that are related to existing industries and where we might have some strength. And so those are areas that I hope the Ledge will be paying attention to and will be thinking about as they consider ways to encourage diversifying Hawaii's economy.
You mentioned the unemployment numbers, and I'm interested because no matter who we have on this program, whether it's the mayor of a county or a police chief, or even in the private sector, no one seems to be able to find workers. Government on average is, I think, about 30% vacancies, no matter who you talk to. So how are we looking when it comes to, bringing up those workers so that we can have more productivity in government and outside?
So this is really a long-term challenge for Hawaii. Hawaii's always had relatively lower unemployment rates than is true nationally, and businesses have struggled to find qualified, talented workers. Go back any time period in history and ask businesses if it's easy for them to find the qualified workers that they need. They'll say no. But it obviously was much worse during the pandemic. It has gotten better, but it's mostly gotten better because businesses aren't hiring as much. Right, so we've seen a pretty sharp slowdown in business formation and new business starts. We've seen a pretty sharp slowdown in hiring, a sharp slowdown in quits. So the labor market has softened, and but the fundamental problem of not being able to find qualified workers for just about any kind of job is that our labor force has shrunk by 20, 25,000 people. And our population has shrunk, our labor force has shrunk, and that's because people are aging out of the workforce. They're choosing, we have not seen an increase in labor force participation. And so with out-migration and an aging population, this is a permanent problem. It's not going to go away. And basically, businesses, state government, the university, we have to change the way that we recruit and retain workers and try to keep those old folks around longer like me, but also bring up younger, and think about our requirements for degree requirements, for example. Do you really need that advanced degree, or do you really need a bachelor's in order to get an entry position? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, interesting. Well, as we also discussed, this past year, we also want to look ahead to 2025. What do you think is in store for just the economy as a whole? Of course, we're coming into a new administration that's also going to have obviously some changes in policy. What are some of the things that you predict will happen this next year?
So, we released our fourth quarter forecast report earlier this month, and the key, and actually the title of that invoked uncertainty. And the new administration, basically no one at this point can tell you what the policies are going to be, right? The ones that are the most certain are a continuation or an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that's pretty straightforward. But will we see all the other tax cuts that were tossed about during the campaign? We don't think so. We think we'll see some of them, but not nearly all of them. And so when we did that forecast, we had to make a set of assumptions around tariffs. And so the uncertainty comes from tax policy, tariffs, immigration policy, and we made assumptions about each of those that was much less extreme than the sort of campaign promises. And as we get into the new year, we'll start to have some more certainty, right? Come January 20, we'll start to see, are we going to see mass deportations, or are we going to see across-the-board tariffs? If we were to see the full gamut of policies that were discussed, then the things that we would be watching and would be concerning to us would be impacts on the labor market from deportations and immigration restrictions, impacts on inflation from tariffs and from higher wages, and impacts on interest rates. So if you've got higher inflation, then I'm not saying that interest rates are going to go shooting up or inflation's going to go shooting up. Rather, they're just not going to come down like we thought they were going to, right? And so anything that keeps interest rates higher for longer is something that none of us really want to see, whether you're in the housing market or you're looking at your revolving credit card debt, for example.
Let's talk about the housing market. What are your thoughts on how things are going? This governor has said time and again that his number one priority is affordable housing. How do you think that, that goal aligns with some of the things that you're talking about?
So, the work that's being done right now, and there is a lot going on, right? There's the governor's office has released a list of projects that are sort of in the pipeline. Pipeline doesn't mean they've broken ground, right? So some of them will have to get through an entitlement process, we'll have to get permits, so there's all kinds of things that can get in the way there. So it's healthy to be a little skeptical, but there's also good progress in the legislature, there's good progress at city councils, basically everyone's pulling in the same direction, almost everyone, right? There are still roadblocks, some NIMBYism, or just protecting your neighborhood in a politer way of putting it. But so there's much happening, and we'll see more of this legislative session. Things like zoning, the way that we zone properties. Can we allow for more multifamily building? Those types of things. And then of course there's insurance, which is a huge deal. We wrote a little bit about that in our forecast report. And and that is a sort of a new permanent reality, right? We're going to face higher costs for insurance across the board because of climate change and risk, as the insurance companies and the reinsurance companies reassess their risk. So that's not going away, but we're going to get past that initial crisis when everybody was shocked, right, by the rate increases. Now we can start planning for them and building into our budget, but it permanently adds an additional cost to housing.
Want to expand a little bit more on the legislative session and what maybe you're expecting to see. We are hearing talks of some potential changes in tax structures, in how much the state will provide for the local counties. There is just a lot of things floating out there of what could potentially happen. Also taking into consideration what happened last legislative session with some of the tax changes there. As a whole, how is the state budget doing, and how much wiggle room do you think lawmakers have this legislative session?
So the council meets, I think, January 8th. So it's not too far off before we'll be giving it an update. And frankly, before we adopted a 3.5% forecast for general fund tax revenue for fiscal 25. If you look at the data we have, I think the most recent data we have is through December. We'll get the December data or preliminary December data soon, but it's up like 13%. There was a big boost in one category, and unusual, right? Not something that will repeat itself every month. And so going into this session, I really don't think there's going to be sort of a sense of enormous urgency to address potential shortfalls coming down the road because of last year's tax cuts, right? And the council made a forecast in their last council meeting that left us with positive revenue growth every fiscal year going forward, even with the tax cuts. And so there's going to be some cautiousness on the part of policymakers on the spending side. They don't have a lot of wiggle room because of the forthcoming tax cuts, but I also don't think it's a crisis. I really don't think that the conversations around taking excise tax surcharge and taking TAT away from the counties, those all sunset, right? I will be very surprised if there's action to take those away in this session.
The governor has said that he's going to go for the green fee a third time, using that money for climate impact fees or climate change restoration, climate change projects, and then also for the insurance market. Given the financial health of the state, how compelling do you think that argument will be? Do you think that he will be able to do it this time?
I would say so. Look, when you're talking about changes at the ledge, it's not uncommon for it to take 3 or 4 or 5 tries, right? And my sense is that if the dollars would be allocated, say, to protect the environment, to protect Hawaii's natural resources in a way that is connected with the visitor experience, right? So if we were allocating that money to make sure that we were protecting our shorelines and imagine this, cleaning up our beach bathrooms. If the money is going into a way that supports the tourism, I think you'll get support from the tourism industry. And I think there's a shot that this can happen.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but Carl Bonham, one last final thought from you. Overall, it sounds like 2025 is going to be pretty good.
So our forecast is that it's quite a bit better than 2024, right? That we'll be moving past the still lingering effects of the wildfire. We still have a roaring construction sector going. We don't see any huge disruption coming out of the new administration in DC. So yeah, I think we're cautiously optimistic.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Thank you so much for coming in today. Right after the break, we are going to be focusing in on the world of politics. Stay with us. You're watching Spotlight Now. Welcome back to Spotlight Now. We are continuing our conversation, looking back at the biggest headlines of 2024 and also the outlook for 2025. Politics made a lot of news, and that's why we've brought in Hawaii News Now political analyst Colin Moore, also a professor at the University of Hawaii. So, putting on your professor hat today, what is the biggest lesson? What is the biggest headline out of 2024?
Politically, I think the biggest headline locally is Scott Saike's loss. It's so rare that we have a powerful member of the state legislature lose their seat in a primary. Of course, this was the third time he was challenged by Kimiko Iwamoto, but it shakes up the entire structure of the legislature. Now we will have a new Speaker of the House, Nadine Nakamura, but I think it also illustrates something a little deeper, which is that there is this underlying frustration about incumbency, about the Hawaii Democratic Party. I mean, people have tried to figure out what it was, what caused Saiki to lose. I don't think you can point to a specific policy that he championed. In many ways, he's a very, relatively center-left Democrat. He does come from a pretty challenging district to run in. Kaka'ako has a lot of condos. It's hard to run there, and he faced a fierce opponent. Kim Koko Iwamoto was out there early, basically attending every community meeting she could. But I think his loss really, for voters, I think he came to represent their frustrations with the legislature. And I think you also saw that in the loss of another incumbent, which was Big Island Mayor Mitch Roth.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that Big Island race and how that ultimately happened. Because when we had the primary, Mayor Roth was in the lead, and he was someone who was, leading in the races. And then when it came down to the general election, we really saw this surge of Dr. Kimo Alameda, who is now the mayor. What do you think happened in that race and how things transpired the way that they did?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember, I didn't really even know who Kimo Alameda was back in the spring, and I was over in Hilo in June, and I saw this tremendous support. All of these people lining the road, holding his signs, and I thought, this is someone I've really got to pay attention to. There's something's happening in this race. Now, I think there are a couple of issues here. First, Kimo Alameda got the backing of HGA, UPW, the very powerful public sector unions. And that was in large part because Mayor Roth refused to support the sort of generous hazard pay that some public employees were expecting. Kimo Alameda also was able to run as the change candidate. I think every time you saw him in any kind of media event, he would say change about 8 to 10 times. He criticized the mayor about not giving enough attention to Kona, which was sort of interesting because that really was a place where Mayor Roth had a lot of support. So I think that was a pretty smart move in terms of his campaign. But I think he really just ran on this change platform that he was going to speed up housing, that everything Mayor Roth was doing was a little too slow.
No, go on. What's interesting also about that, though, is now he's made all these promises about, I believe it's over $70 million that the county does not have anymore, right? That money is spent, and Roth had said that time and again in those debates. So do you think that all that union support dries up if he cannot actually produce that money?
I do. He's made a lot of big promises. He doesn't have a lot of government experience at this level. I think he does benefit by being an extremely charismatic candidate. I've said before that he reminds me a little bit of Billy Kenoi. I think that's going to help him. He comes from a mental health background, is clearly good at thinking of creative, community-based solutions, but he's going to have to deliver on those core issues. And some of it was speeding up the permitting process, getting more houses built. Those are things that are, deep in the bureaucracy, areas that he doesn't have a lot of experience with. And I think the voters are going to hold him to account. He's made a lot of big promises, and now he's going to have to deliver.
Let's talk a little bit about the sort of rise, if you will, of the Republican Party. It's not not a significant rise, but they did pick up seats, and they seem to have more participation in getting candidates out there to fill some of the vacancies that they haven't been able to fill in the past in elections. Your thoughts on just how the Republicans did overall, and moving forward, what it looks like for the GOP?
Look, this was a fantastic year for the Republicans. Of course, this is still a heavily Democratic state, but they're in the best position they've been in 20 years. They have 3 Senate seats, 9 House seats. They picked up some pretty challenging races. They knocked off a couple of incumbents, even some pretty prominent incumbents. And you can really see that their base of support on the Leeward Coast in Ewa Beach has grown. Candidates like, for example, Elijah Pierick, who I thought might not make it through this time, but did manage to squeak through. Now he's a pretty solid incumbent. He's won 2 elections. I think we can really begin to talk about those as red districts. I think the Republicans have done a lot of smart things. I think they understood that there was a lot of frustration about housing. They really ran more populist campaigns, really local campaigns that focused on crime and housing. And so I think they've set themselves up perhaps to expand their base a little bit more. I think any Democratic incumbent who's in those areas on the Leeward Coast, in Ewa Beach, they should be worried, because now that the Republicans have some victories, nothing succeeds like success. They're going to be able to recruit better quality candidates.
Well, that Perrick race, the Perrick versus Corey Rosenlee race was really interesting. I think it came down to, 20
Yeah.
votes? So it shows you that every vote counts. Let's talk about voting itself in this election. We saw late into the night, we were all waiting for that first
We were.
printout, and man, we were waiting a long time. Let's hear your thoughts on how Scott Nago did and what's going to happen in the next election.
Well, look, it was shameful. I don't think there's any other way to put it or to sugarcoat it. I mean, we were all waiting until 11:30, 11:45 for that first printout. But more than just people in the media who want to know what the results are and report on them, it was that voters were standing in these lines for hours, for 8 hours in some cases. There were only 2 places you could vote in person on an island of 1 million people. I think even some of the mainland observers who were later interviewed about this were pretty shocked. I have this sense that the election office is trying to fight voters that vote a lot. There's just a lot of voters who prefer to cast their ballot in person, whether it's because of tradition or they just feel it's more secure. And I don't really understand why the elections office hasn't accommodated those. Now, this, of course, the voter service centers are a county responsibility, but I expect that they finally learn their lesson. I think we're going to get more in-person voter stations next time because there's clearly a significant number of voters, particularly Republicans, but not only Republicans, who just want to vote in person. It's not that much money. I think we can accommodate their preferences.
We are now we have gone through year 2 of the Green administration. I just want to get your overall thoughts on how you think Governor Green has done thus far, and just his overall style and some of his accomplishments, and your assessment of the work that the governor has done thus far.
Well, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think the governor's legacy is really going to hinge on how he handles the recovery from the Maui fires. I think he has made some progress in housing. I think that people have appreciated his more aggressive approach to housing. Of course, the governor is an excellent communicator, and so I think that's always been a point in his favor. But whether or not he can pull off this grand Maui settlement, I think will really will cement his legacy. If he can, then I think he's probably going to be safe from a serious reelection challenge. If he can't, if that collapses, then he might be in some danger. I mean, his legacy is very connected to Maui's successful recovery.
Interesting. And so when we look at the legislature, is this the year that we get the green fee, medical marijuana? I think there's a lot of talk about paid family leave. A lot of the social services networks are really, the nonprofits are really pushing for that. What do you think are, on the legislature's checklist, if you will?
Well, certainly recreational marijuana. We've
I'm
seemed
sorry,
to talk
yes,
about that.
not medical. We've had that
Yes.
for a while. Recreational.
Recreational. We seem to talk about that every year. This might be the year. It isn't an election year, so legislators won't have to face their constituents immediately. I know that the chair, David Tarnas, has been working hard to modify that bill to address potential concerns. The governor is relatively supportive. Even at the federal level, there seems to be support for it. And I think Hawaii would like to legalize it before it becomes legalized at the federal level so we can figure out how to manage it. I mean, surprisingly to me, President-elect Trump has even indicated that he might be for recreational legalization. So I think that has a real chance, but it always, there's always a risk it gets caught up. There are some legislators who are against it in principle, and of course the law enforcement community and the mayors have been opposed to it. Some of the other issues, I think that the green fee you mentioned, again, that's one of these issues where pretty much everyone is in support of it. The public is in support of it. Certainly the governor is. He's planning to use that to partly finance climate change, to close the revenue hole as a result of these historic tax cuts. But in this bill, the devil is really in the details. How do you implement that? There are constitutional issues. You don't want to just put the tax on people who are staying in hotels because that lets people who are staying in Airbnbs off the hook. And so that seems to be where it's always hung up, is how do we implement it? Not that we don't like it in theory, but you can't just pass a tax on everyone coming off the plane. That's not constitutional.
Mm-hmm. And what about that paid family leave?
Paid family leave, I'm a little less optimistic about. That's something that family service providers have been working on for a long time. It's something we should pass. It's something that I think is great public policy. But given all the competing priorities, I doubt it's going to be the year for paid family leave.
I want to talk a little bit about just the overall makeup of the Hawaii State House with a new speaker. We talked about, Representative Saiki and Chair Saiki losing that position, losing that race, ultimately the control of the House. And now we're seeing Representative Nakamura fall into that position. Your thoughts about the structure of the House and her leadership, and maybe some of the things that she may really have to show in this her first year as leading the House.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. So there are of the 51 members of the House, 27 of them have only served 2 years. So there's a lot of new blood in the House. There's a new speaker. Speaker Nakamura, I think, is a moderate, but she comes from a planning background. She knows county politics and county needs very well because she was the managing director of Kauai County. I expect her to mainly focus on housing. That's always been a area where she is specialized in. So issues like the Aloha Homes package that's been proposed for a long time. I know that she's going to work a little more on allowing families who make a little bit more money to qualify for some affordable housing. So I expect her to really zero in on that issue. The other thing she's going to have to deal with, though, is we talked about the Republicans, but there are a lot of progressives who got elected in this last cycle. People like Kim Koko Iwamoto, Tina Grandinetti, Ikaika Hussey. And so I think she's going to have to balance a more polarized legislature because those progressives are going to want to move to the left on some social services issues for sure.
One of the interesting things that came, and people may not have paid much attention to it, but we also saw a new face at OHA in Kaikahele, the return of Kaikahele. He kind of laid low for a while, and then Mililani Trask decided not to run. He took that seat, and now, first time ever that a new OHA member also is the OHA board chair. He has said that one of his priorities, he said on this program, in fact, one of his priorities is to sort of have the board members divide the ledge and harbor out all these personal relationships. OHA now going back after Kaka'ako Makai. What are your thoughts about the return of Kaikahele and also just sort of like the visibility of OHA?
Yeah, I think Kaikahele is going to be a terrific OHA chair. I mean, it does seem like he's really zeroed in on the development of Kaka'ako Makai. He's going to bring his experience as a legislator, and I think that's going to help OHA navigate the ledge effectively to build this development that I think has really been at the center of their strategy moving forward. And now that Scott Saiki isn't there, who was an opponent of that, it may have a chance to go forward. The other thing is that I think Kaikahele will give OHA a lot more visibility. He's a charismatic speaker. People know who he is. I mean, he's one of the most well-known political figures in the state. And so I think when they're thinking, what is OHA doing? What is OHA's position? Kahele can be there, I think, to articulate that, not just better, but I think he will get more recognition because people know who he is. So I expect that OHA is going to sort of first do a little more of an insider strategy. I mean, there's going to be this charm offensive with the legislature, I think, to kind of restart their relationship. But I also think you can expect them to be a little more public in their positions. I mean, to try to mold public opinion, broad public opinion, not just among Native Hawaiians than they have in the past under Kahele's leadership.
Do you think that the dynamics between the administration and Governor Green and the OHA chair, Kaikahele, and when you think back to that election when they ran against each other, things got heated at times. And so how do you think that relationship is going to be moving forward?
They sure did. I mean, they called each other all sorts of names that I won't repeat right now. Look, I think they have a complicated relationship. I also remember from a PBS Insight show when they were asked who would you vote for if you couldn't vote for yourself, and they each said each other, which I thought was sort of interesting. They've known each other for a long time. What I would say is they're both practical politicians. Both of them are mainly focused on building housing for Hawaiians and for the rest of the state. It doesn't help either of them to get into a big fight. I'm not saying that couldn't happen because they're also known to be pretty aggressive when they're pushed. And you saw that come out in the campaign. But I think right now there's every incentive for them to work together. And because they both come from this political background, they're used to negotiating, they're used to making deals. And I expect that they'll be able to work together pretty effectively.
I'm interested in something that you were talking about, looking at the Green administration and the idea that Maui is really sort of the big test for the governor. He's going into his third year. You'd expect after this session, perhaps we start to hear the, sizzling of new names, perhaps anyone to challenge him. How vulnerable do you think he is?
I don't think he's particularly vulnerable, but it doesn't mean he's not vulnerable at all. I mean, the most recent public polling we have has him about 62%. That's very good. But with the right candidate, he could potentially be vulnerable. He certainly has a lot of campaign money that in part is designed to scare away any potential competitors. I think that he's also going to be really outspoken against the Trump administration, in part not only because he opposes a lot of what they're planning to do, but I think he wants to be thought of as one of the blue state leaders against Trump. You already saw him on national news going after the nomination of RFK, and so I think he will use that in part to remind people that he's the strong Democrat defending Hawaii, but it doesn't mean he's not vulnerable. And I think that if the recovery on Maui, and we're getting to that critical point in the recovery, if it isn't successful or isn't perceived as being successful, then that really will create an opening for a strong opponent.
And can the same be said about Mayor Bisson? I mean, how do you think that he's kind of fared in this time? I mean, he came on during right before the wildfires broke out. He's had a few years now under his belt. Your thoughts about his political future and just where he stands right now as the mayor of Maui?
I think he's definitely going to get a challenge. I think he's very vulnerable. I think he's recovered from a really rough start. I think he's a little more used to communicating in the way you need to communicate as a county level executive. I mean, he came from a judicial background where he was sort of used to just making pronouncements and having things happen. I think he's adjusted. I think he is a more effective politician. But people in Maui are still furious about this fire. And there's going to be a challenge. It's hard to tell where that's going to come from, though, because Maui County politics is interestingly polarized. There are, we saw that in the last county council election. There is a very well-organized group of kind of pro-development, pro-tourism folks, and people who are much more skeptical of tourism and development. But they are both organized factions, and I expect we're going to get probably a challenge from both sides there. I mean, Maui politics is the most interesting and probably the most sophisticated in the state, and I think people are still very upset with Bisson. It doesn't mean he's going to lose, but I do think he's vulnerable.
I want to ask you briefly about the impact you think the Trump administration is going to have on Hawaii. We heard Professor Bonham say earlier that economically he thinks we'll actually be okay. Even if federal, we'll see what happens with tax cuts, we'll see what happens with tariffs. But if our governor is an outspoken blue state Democrat fighting the administration, how does that sort of bear out for the rest of us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we saw this last time when Trump was president, although Green, of course, is a lot more outspoken than Ige ever was. I think Hawaii is particularly vulnerable if the president-elect goes forward with cutting some of the big federal programs that he's talked about. If there are big cuts, for example, the Department of Education, our DOE system is very dependent on the huge federal grants it gets. HART is very dependent on getting the last parts of its federal funding through. I think people are very nervous that the Trump administration could go after that. I think that our congressional delegation kind of goes back and forth between saying that they're going to oppose everything Trump does and saying that they have some good friends on the other side of the aisle and they can work together with them. It's going to be difficult to target Hawaii directly. I'm not so worried about that because a lot of the federal programs we depend on, also very red states, places like West Virginia depend on as well. So I don't think the president will target Hawaii, but I'm not sure that our reputation as a very blue state is going to do us any favors over the next 4 years.
All right, we're wrapping up here our time with you, but any final thoughts about, just this past year and maybe what you're looking forward to in this next year and what are some things to watch out for?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll say two things that don't get as many headlines that I'd love for the legislature to take on. I mean, they've talked about making some House rules changes that would make the chairs explain why they defer bills. That's often unknown. That would allow a little more transparency in the legislature. Maybe not every bill needs to go to House Finance. So opening up that process a little bit is something I'd love to see. The other big bill that I'd love to see the Ledge tackle, which would help our problem of getting enough candidates to run for office, is public campaign finance. This has been talked about a few times. It would either give a grant to people who are running for office or provide some matching funds. We've had a system like this in place since 1980, but it's underfunded. It's basically not used anymore. Reinvigorating that, I think, would really inject some life into our political system. So I'd love to see the Ledge pass that, although I'm not terribly optimistic that's going to go through.
We always love talking with you. The time is too short. We'll have you back after the legislature opens. Thank you so much for being here,
Happy to
Colin
be here.
Moore. We are going to be talking about the potpourri of other news that hit in 2024 with Chad Blair from Civil Beat. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
from the moment you wake up.
Hawaii News Now brings you the stories that impact your day.
With more on the breaking news, we go live to Casey Lund.
Ready with the push alert? I'm going live. We have an update to the breaking news we brought you this morning on Sunrise.
Okay, guys, as soon as this wraps, toss to Mahia.
And we've been covering this story all day.
Now we go live to Mahia for a new development.
Stand by for breaking news. They just captured the suspect.
That's confirmed?
Yes, sources just confirmed it.
The news you need the moment it breaks.
Here on Hawaii News Now.
First alert traffic is like always having a helpful passenger right next to you.
There's a crash up ahead in the left lane.
When we see a backup, we'll tell you live on TV
That doesn't look too good.
and send an alert to your phone.
I'll type, you drive.
First alert traffic on TV, streaming, and on the Hawaii News Now app.
Keeping you and your ohana safe.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Ryan Kalei-Suchi. Connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands. Going in depth with Hawaii's leaders. And taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Well, we've talked politics, we've talked economy, now we're talking about the rest of the story, as they say, with Chad Blair from Honolulu Civil Beat. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Paul Harvey's with it.
Yes, exactly. That's who
now the rest of the story.
That is a throwback I'm not sure that all of our audience will relate to. But looking back on 2024, your organization broke a lot of news, and there were a lot of Hawaii headlines that took us by surprise. But what stands out to you?
You know, I checked with Courtney Teague, who handles social media for Civil Beat. She does more than that. I said, run the numbers, tell me what was the most popular. Amazingly, 3 of the stories that ran just in the last few weeks got more attention than just about anything else. First of all, that United Healthcare CEO has ties to Hawaii. Luigi Mangione, I believe is how it's pronounced. Well, Stuart Yurton and others jumped on that story, and we managed to break the angle that he had back problems. And as now people are speculating, that may have led into his anger with the healthcare system. That thing just went nuts on social media. We had a lot of national media calling us and saying, hey, can we reprint that? Yes, of course you can. Just credit Civil Beat. Here's another one that really caught a lot of attention locally, the death of Mike Miskey, the, if you will, the crime figure dying in prison. A lot of people reacted to that. Kudos to Ian Lind, who has his own blog but also contributes to us, really leading the charge there. Many, many people touched by that story. And then 2 others, HGTV Renovation Aloha. Now, I'm not into this kind of stuff, but everybody I know, including my mom, loves to watch these people come in, take homes, flip them, sell them for more money. Well, it turns out, thanks to Christina Jedra, our reporter, there were some problems with the permits that those 2 people, the couple, got to have this program. And DPP, Department of Planning and Permitting, is now cracking down on that. Social media went nuts on that story. One other really caught me by surprise. The guy that played the Santa Claus at the malls in West Maui, in the Lahaina area, left Hawaii for good. He went to California, one of many people leaving, an exodus really because of the tragic fires that happened in August 2023. And kudos to Brittany Light for breaking that story. So that's all over the map, right? You have murder, you've got Santa Claus, you've got healthcare workers. What am I missing here?
And home renovation too.
Yeah. Exactly. So we were all over the map, but I think it also kind of underscores the variety of stories that we cover at Civil Beat.
Yeah, no doubt. One of the ones, as you mentioned, was Mike Miskey. So beyond just, of course, the death that was reported, this has been a story that has really captivated Hawaii for the last few years. Your thoughts overall of just how things have progressed with this trial and the coverage that you guys have had to do? I mean, it just, at times, it seemed that things were getting crazier and crazier as the story unfolded. But really, things came to a head this past year with that story.
It took a long time. Madeline Valera, covering the trial, actually, and other reporters have come in as well. I think the thing that gets me the most is I think about the allegations that somehow Miskey had murdered this young man, apparently from a boat, because he was involved in a car accident that killed Miskey's son. And that just terrifies me. One of our reporters, Nick Ruby, actually met Miskey before all this stuff went down. Kind of got a chill up his spine because the guy wanted to talk to him, the fact that Miskey even knew who he was. But I think the thing that I take away the most is we're not immune from crime. We're not immune from very serious mafia-like tactics, and that troubles me, given that we think we're the land of aloha.
It's so interesting, and Ian Lind has done tremendous work on this, just covering this trial inside and out. I'm interested to hear about the engagement online, what you saw from readers, because what's unique about Civil Beat is that you have to use, you have to be accountable for the comments you leave. You can't just have sort of like a ghost email and just write whatever you want, right? So how is that engagement? What are the stories that you think, you've talked about what sort of trafficked the most, but what generates the comments, and what are people really talking about?
Well, it depends on what social media that you're looking at. If you look at comments, we have comments on our website, the Civil Beat website, and I actually help moderate those. There's human beings looking at those and reading every single one, and yes, sometimes rejecting them. And it's a complicated, time-consuming process. But then there's Facebook, and then there's Instagram, where we really don't have any control over that, and you can see all sorts of different levels. The thing I think I noticed the most about commentary, particularly on those stories, is, and this is my most troubling consideration when it comes to social media and the internet in general, is it seems to bring out the worst in people, and it's particularly when you're anonymous. When Civil Beat first started, we had people actually put their real name and even their photo, and if they didn't want their photo, we'd let them use an avatar, but it had to be who they were. That's not the case anymore, and I think that gives people the freedom, the liberty to really sometimes be a complete jerk. But in terms of the reaction, it was the injustice, the anger, not only with the Miskey murder, not only with this Mangione fellow, and as well as the flipping the houses, is you see people very upset that there's a different standard of justice out there. I think with Miskey in particular, there was a reaction that he got what he deserved.
Let's talk a lot about another headline that made news this year, and that was the announcement that David Lassner would be resigning or retiring, I should say, at the end of this year. That led to a search for a new UH president. Your thoughts about that headline, because that story in and of itself made some headlines on Civil Beat about this new incoming UH president and the retirement of David Lassner and his legacy moving forward.
Wendy Hensel, the new UH president, Stuart Yurton, our editor, Patty Epler, helping him with that, and through a series of record requests, but really hard shoe leather journalism, calling people, getting people to give tips. And bottom line, the story that we reported is Hensel, at 2 of her previous academic posts, had serious charges of discrimination filed against her, and it's all documented. None of this came up publicly during the search, during the interviews with Wendy Hensel when she came out here. We didn't see it in any of the local reporting. And I can tell you the Board of Regents is strongly defending their view. They're saying it was by the book. We did this exactly the way we should. In fact, Stuart's reporting shows you really missed something pretty big. How could you miss these major discrimination cases that happened at her 2 prior institutions? And not only that, there's even language in the search requirements that says you got to look specifically for these kind of things. How did you miss that? Were the Board of Regents really transparent? Was the UH community, and by extension the entire state, disturbed by this whole process? I would argue from Stuart's reporting that all of us were let down by this.
One of the areas that Civil Beat has covered to a large degree is the transformation of Tulsi Gabbard. We talked politics with Colin Moore, but I'm interested to sort of hear your perspective on, Tulsi Gabbard leaving the Democrats officially this year after, years of being a contributor on Fox News and really seeming to gravitate toward the right, and also now having a very close relationship with the incoming president.
Tulsi Gabbard. I know that name somehow. Love her or hate her, and she has people strongly in both camps. She's got ambition, and it's hard to believe, but she actually served in 3 different levels of government here. She was on the city council, she was at the state legislature, she represented us in Congress, and of course she also served in the Middle East. That's really remarkable. Calvin Say just retired after 50 years at the ledge for the most of the time, and then at the council, but he didn't go anywhere else or do anything else. Tulsi was gone long ago, and I really think that's really the story. I would say, besides Barack Obama, and forgive me if you're a Dan Inouye supporter, and I am, Tulsi Gabbard is the most well-known politician from Hawaii, and you got to give her credit. She's very ambitious. Having said that, there's a lot of people that feel she's a turncoat, that she betrayed the party that she represented. Remember, she actually ran for president as a Democrat. But love her or hate her, she is not going to be leaving, I think, the national scene anytime soon.
Let's talk a little bit also about what you expect from this legislative session. There were, we talked a little bit about with Colin Moore. You, of course, also track a lot what's happening at the Capitol. Your thoughts about maybe some of the headlines we can expect to see in 2025?
Recreational marijuana will die. Maybe this is the year, and I heard earlier Colin Moore, my good friend and colleague, talking about it. As liberal and as blue state as we think we are, there's a very big conservative streak here in Hawaii. It has in part to do with the strong religious elements that are here. In many ways, a lot of those Democrats are really conservative, and there's a reason why the recreational marijuana gets killed year after year after year. Remember, by the way, not only do we have medical marijuana, but we actually have decriminalized marijuana. You can have small amounts. I don't know that it's going to happen anytime soon. I'd love to see that happen, but I've seen it die again and again. Having said that, Colin is right on by saying with Scott Saiki now gone, I think that will change the dynamic at the legislature, and things that didn't make it before might get through. He mentioned Kaka'ako Makai in the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. That's a very good observation. That could really change things. I will say this, though, Ryan. My one lesson following the legislature over 20 plus years now is you go in thinking it's going to be about this, and it comes out being about something else. Nobody saw that tax cut that Colin and Carl were talking about earlier. Nobody saw it being as big as it is. It is the biggest in state history. $8 billion in lost revenue over the next 8 years. I mean, it's going to be huge. But you never know going in what ends up being the story, and that's the lesson that I've learned.
What are you paying attention to beyond politics in 2025? What are some of the areas that you hope readers also will engage in?
I'm concerned about the media. I'm concerned about the news desert that we're seeing, particularly on the neighbor islands. Civil Beat was on Kauai a couple times this year. We were sponsoring forums. And I went over there to meet with the county council candidates, Bernard Carvalho and others. We also sat down with Derek Kawakami, the mayor. You had him on recently too. And both the council candidates and the mayor said, thank you for coming over here. Thank you for asking us about our stories, because nobody there is really doing any reporting. You know about what's happened with the Garden Island and the amalgamation, really the shrinkage of local news. We're seeing what's happening with the Star Advertiser, which of course owns many of these papers on the neighbor islands. And that's what I really worry about a lot. One of the stories we found out about was those EV kapuna on the North Shore of Kauai that was not being reported, although I think Hawaii News Now did get the story. Kudos for you guys. We got it as well. But how can you possibly do local media without covering and going to these neighbor islands? And that's the thing that I worry about. And I encourage people listening and following the news, let us know, give us a call. That's the only way we're going to be able to find out.
All right. Well, final question might be your hardest question. Any New Year's resolutions? Or do you do New Year's resolutions?
I'm asleep by 9. I've had a beverage or two. I put my earplugs in. I learned a long time ago not to do that, but hope springs eternal, Ryan.
Well, we love seeing you. Thanks for coming, and we hope to see you again in the new year. Mahalo.
Thanks, Yanji.
Okay, good to see you. Stay with us. Spotlight Now continues right after this.
From the moment you wake up.
Hawaii News Now brings you the stories that impact your day.
With more on the breaking news, we go live to Casey Lund.
Ready with the push alert? I'm going live. We have an update to the breaking news we brought you this morning on Sunrise.
Okay, guys, as soon as this wraps, toss to Mahea.
And we've been covering this story all day.
Now we go live to Mahea for a new development.
Stand by for breaking news. They just captured the suspect.
That's confirmed?
Yes, sources just confirmed it.
The news you need the moment it breaks.
Here on Hawaii News Now.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suchi. Connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands. Going in depth with Hawaii's leaders. And taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Well, welcome back. Really a great show to kind of look back and take pause to look back at all the things that happened this year. Of course, we saw so much happening on the political front and as well as the economy as a whole when we started the conversation with Carl Bonham. I will note, I always enjoy when we talk to Carl Bonham because you get a real pulse for where things are going. And if there's a panic in Carl's voice, I get a little worried. But he sounds pretty assured that things are going to be okay.
Yeah, the construction market is booming, as he noted. Tourism is doing relatively well, minus, of course, the Japanese visitor, which he says 4 to 5 years to come back. That is a long, long time. But he did note that he is expecting 4.5% inflation for 2025 here in Hawaii. That is not good news because it's been around 3%, and none of us want things to get any more expensive. Interesting to see how the legislature will respond to that, what kind of money they're going to have. Colin Moore talking about the new dynamics now that Psyche is no longer part of that mix and what happens with the new House Speaker. So very interesting there, and talking about some potential vulnerabilities for the governor and whether we're going to get the green fade.
Yeah, a lot to look for with this legislative session happening in just a few weeks, really kicking off there at the state capitol, and also really watching to see how this new House Speaker, Nadine Nakamura, ends up leading this delegation, if you will, of her new Democrats that she's kind of in charge of, but in the entire House as well, House Democrats and Republicans, and also seeing the dynamics play out between Kai Kahele at Ohana and the governor, once political rivals, now looking for ways to find maybe some common ground here.
And we'll have a chance to ask him about that directly. Our first guest in the new year is the governor, so make sure to join us here in the new year. We wish you health and happiness. Stay safe out there. Watch out for those fireworks, and take care of yourself. Thanks so much for spending this year with us.
Happy New Year. We'll see you all next year.